Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Vamos a empezar la mesa número 3, central mesa número 6, y vamos a organizarla, si a ustedes les parece bien, de la siguiente manera. Primero va a hablar el profesor Ramesh Chandra Das, que ha tenido la desgracia de perder una maleta en su camino hacia aquí, su maleta con Lufthansa, y que ahora ha extraviado su pasaporte. Entonces le vamos a dar la palabra en primer lugar, abrimos un turno de coloquio para que se pueda ir. Good afternoon. We're going to start with table number 6. In the first place, the floor is going to be taken by Mr. Ramesh Chandra Das, who is going to speak about governance, a precondition to growth, a study of selected countries in the globalized world. Mr. Chandra was very unfortunate. He lost his suitcase with Lufthansa company yesterday coming over. And now he can find his passport. So we're going to give him the floor first so he can present his paper, have a brief colloquium, and then he can leave either to the police or to find his passport and a little bit of peace. In the second place, we're going to have our Portuguese team submitting their paper on presidential power, the dilemma of the Portuguese democratic system. Thirdly, Ms. Natalia Pishkunova. Pishkunova will speak about a non-recognized state in civil war conditions, assessing the status and perspective of territorial entities in former Somalia. Then we'll close that block with these two interventions, and the panel will be closed by Ms. Vida Masikenaite. Well, excuse my pronunciation. Who will present a paper on coping with scarcity, Chinese state business relations in fishery industry. I don't want to have any role which is not mine, so whenever you want, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yes. So, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to Dr. Rafael for introducing me. I am from the Department of Economics, Katua College, West Bengal, India. The paper which I am going to present here is titled as Is Governance a Precondition to Growth? A study of selected countries in the globalized world. So, if we look back to the economic events in the world for the recent past and the experience of some African countries, that we find that governance has been one of the important factors in determining the status of development of a country. So, particularly the concept of governance is important when most of the countries in the world are in a globalized version, all are interlinked. So, I must quote Mr. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of UN. Good governance is perhaps the single most important factor in eradicating poverty and promoting development in the phase of globalization. So, due to this view and some experience of World Bank, the concept of World Bank is that good governance is a necessary precondition to growth. And for that purpose, there are some critics who are trying to negate the conclusion of World Bank, whether good governance is necessary for development or not. So on the basis of that juncture, I have tried to give my effort to give a fresh look to whether the claim of World Bank can be sustained. That means, can the concept of good governance be a necessary precondition to growth? So for that purpose, so I just quote the concept of good governance. This is normative approach, and this is particularly developed by Kaufman. So Kaufman's concept of governance, there are three-tier concept. There are category 1, which means it captures the process by which a country's governments are selected, metered, and replaced by the power of citizens. So it has two parts. One is voice and accountability. This is abbreviated as VA. And another is political stability and absence of violence. The second category is the ability of the government to formulate and implement effective policies. That covers another 2 points. This is government effectiveness and regulatory quality. Another point, another category is, this is the that captures the respect of citizens and the state for the institutions that govern economic and social interactions among them. That is again two subcategories. One is rule of law, and another is control of corruption. So the World Bank and its associates has tried to quantify this normative approach, and they scaled it from minus 2.5 to plus 2.5. Minus 2.5 means worst governance of a country, plus 2.5 is superior governance of country. And there is the debate between good governance concept and bad governance concept, or whether government is helping to the growth or not. A huge literature. I have followed some of them. And after that literature, I have selected my hypothesis, or that objective of my study. There are two hypotheses. One is whether good governance is a necessary precondition to growth for all the countries, or the reverse. And number 2 is, do all governance indicators need to play simultaneous role in causing development or growth? For that purpose, I have used the time frame from 96 to 2010, because World Bank's data on governance is available for that period. And the growth is real GDP growth rate. It is also published by World Bank. And to present the data and present the paper, I primarily use the graphical technique and then go for the causality test. This is very statistical analysis, econometric analysis. So this is the analysis given by Granger in 1969. This is a very popular technique. So if anyone want to make or to study the causality between two variables, x and y, then you have to estimate these two equations. Just you note down the equations. Y depends on x and y. X depends on y and x. If we estimate these two equations, then there will be F statistics. These are the testing guideline. If x variable causes y, x may be governance, y may be growth, or y may be governance, x may be growth, anyone. So x causes y if summation alpha I equal to 0 is rejected in equation 1, or summation alpha I not equal to 0 is accepted in equation 1. On the other hand, if y causes x, then the hypothesis of summation alpha I equal to 0 in equation 1 is accepted, and summation delta j equal to 0 in equation 2 is rejected. There can be bilateral causality, means x causes y or y causes x. This will be supported by the hypothesis of summation alpha I not equal to 0 and summation delta j not equal to 0 is accepted. So this is the growth trends. Just come to the figure. We see the North American countries. There are 44 countries, 26 are developing and 18 are developed. So this is the North American countries' growth rates. This is trend of growth rates from 96 to 2010. We see that the trends are falling for all countries. This European country growth rate, your country Spain also falls in this zone. These are also showing the falling growth trends. These Asian countries all are showing upward trends in growth rates. These Latin American countries, those who came from Latin America, you can also follow this. They are also showing the upward trend growth rates. And this is African countries, they are also showing upward trends. But the Australia, this is showing downward trends. So what we see, that all the developing countries are showing upward movements in growth rates, and the developed countries are showing negative trends in growth rates. So now come to the governance trend. Governance trend, there are 44 countries. For each country, there are 6 indicators. So it is very difficult to present in graph. So I can make the summary of this governance in table 1. So table 1 gives the causality result. Okay. So just look at table 1. It is titled as countries in different directions of causalities from governance to growth. Okay, governance becoming the independent variable, growth becoming the dependent variable. This is highly statistical, econometrical. There is no scope to interfere by any means. So these are 4 groups of countries. Plus sign means the country's governance trend is positive, growth is also positive. Minus plus means governance is negative, growth is positive. Plus minus means governance is positive but growth is negative. Minus means both governance and growth are of negative trends. So I find that voice and accountability causes growth for 10 countries. Yes. Political stability causes growth for 10 countries. Governance effectiveness causes growth for 13 countries. Regulatory quality causes growth for 15 countries. Rule of law for 12 countries, and control corruption for 12 countries. This is a very interesting result. I see that all the plus signs happens for developing countries. All the minus signs are happening for developed countries. That means the countries which are growing in governance are also getting result from the growth. The countries which are falling in governance, they are getting their negative results from growth. So if we compare these first and last category, then I can say that World Bank's claim is right. That is, governance is a necessary precondition to growth. But if we go to the minus plus or plus minus sign, then there are many countries. Most of them are developing countries. There you see that the governance trend is weak, but they are growing. So this table shows the result that the country in negative direction of governance can also grow. At the same time, the country in positive direction of growth governance can also grow in negative direction. That means if I compare this, the whole table, the output of this table, the first and 4 criteria gives the sustainability or the acceptance of the World Bank's claim, but second and third gives the negation of this World Bank claim. That means if I go to the World Bank's view absolutely, then it can be proved that they are not saying the right thing for all countries. Okay, this is the result. No one can reject this because it is statistical analysis. I have no hand there. I have found there, whatever I found, I have presented it. Okay. Now, this is for another reason, the causation from growth to governance. That is, growth is the independent variable, governance is dependent variable. Sometimes a country has a good growth rate or prosperous, they try to pull up their governance indicator. Okay, that may be a good sign, but it is not also can be taken as granted that always good growth leads to good governance. So here again, I summarize the entire thing in table 2. Again, there are 4 categories. So here the number of countries are small, but plus sign again holds for developing countries, minus sign again holds for developed countries. That means again we can say World Bank claim is good, right? But when we go to second and third row, we find the inverse relation. Okay, so causality from governance to growth cannot be sustained for all the countries. causality from growth to governance can also not be sustained for all the countries. This is my first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is their approach is that there should be 6 indicators of governance: voice and accountability, political stability, governance effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control corruption, all. But if I go for regression analysis, that is, if I want to quantify what happens if, say if Argentina improves in 1 point in governance, how much it will affect to its growth. So this is the one regression analysis. If I go to this analysis, then again I go back to the table 1, come. Yes. You can find there some bold countries. You can first row, this is Ghana, Peru. They are bold shaped. Second is Ghana. Again, this is Ethiopia. That means positive governance is doing positive to growth significantly, statistically significant for only Ghana, Peru and Ethiopia. All the rest of countries are rejected. That means if I go through the regression analysis, if I go to the statistical significance of this causality, we find only 3 countries, not all. Again, if I go to the minus sign, I find there Canada, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Hungary, United Kingdom, Austria, Portugal, UK. These are all bold shaped. That means there is significant relation between governance and growth. So, if I look at the growth impact of governance, then no necessity of all 6 indicators are there. If I go to Ghana, if I think of Ghana, then only VA, that is voice and accountability, can cause growth. No necessity of all the 5 indicators. If I go to say Canada or say Austria, only I find rule of law is a significant indicator to explain growth. So why should I need other 5 indicators? That means World Bank structure of all 6 indicators are not necessary to explain the growth status or development status of a country. So I think the number of indicators can be trimmed to 2 or 3. I did this effort. So yes. Just a second. Thus only the last line. This means maximum of 2 indicators, not all the 6, have played the role in improving the growth rates of the developing countries. Not all 6 are required. At the same time, maximum of 4 indicators, namely voice and accountability, growth, governance effectiveness, regulatory quality control of corruption, it is for Portugal. If I put the regression analysis and cross inter-governance indicator causality, then the country number of variables trimmed to 2. There are only 3 for Germany. Therefore, governance as a cause of growth observed for 21 countries does not conclude that all of the indicators to play simultaneous role for growth. So we can further trim and okay. So from the intra-governance causality test, it is also inferred that control of corruption causes growth, voice and accountability for the country. Hence, only control of corruption can be the significant governance indicator for Portugal, not 4. So I can conclude that construction of 6 indicators by the World Bank may be overemphasized in all 4 categories of groups of the countries. So just I do the conclusion now. Governance cannot be cause or precondition to growth in general. This is my conclusion. Some countries produce the result that governance can be an end, not as means. End means this is result, not as cause. Where growth can lead to improvements or deterioration of governance. we observe that in the case of governance having role on growth, not all the indicators are needed to work simultaneously. On the other hand, in case of growth causing governance, we observe that changes in growth rates of countries are not needed to influence all the indicators at a time. If I grow, so suppose India grow, that means it cannot grow in all the indicators. Okay, it can influence any one indicator. Hence, we can infer that World Bank's construction of all 6 indicators is overemphasized and need to be trimmed so far as the analysis of 44 countries in the study is concerned. So, thank you. Okay, am I clear to you?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Now we're going to have a short time for questions. Anybody wants to say something? I think the paper was really challenging. It's a pity the figures
Yes, yes,
obscure the discourse,
yes.
but down at the bottom, what the professor of the Department of Economics of Kara College in West Bengal is putting forward is the relationship between governance, growth, and development. And that's a crucial issue
Yes, yes.
right now.
Yes.
Anybody the panel wants to intervene? No?
See, the problem is the language, I think.
Yeah, the language is a barrier.
It's the only problem, not this is the World
yeah,
Bank's
more than
problem.
I feel bad that you have to go there. I know that
So,
afterwards, people will hit up and
Yes.
will want you to have you here and discuss this, but feel free,
yes, yes.
okay?
So, since you understand English better, so am I clear to you about my paper? Okay.
Okay?
Okay, thank you.
His paper is published here,
Yes,
and you can read it and track
yes, yes.
his line
Actually,
of research.
the delegates are from different countries,
Yeah,
and I have selected 44 countries in the world.
yeah,
I think you will fall in this zone. So you try to go ahead with this paper.
yeah.
This is an impetus.
Yeah. The paper will be hung on the Tamoleo? His paper will be on the, only in the book, okay, sorry. Or they can write to you if they want, okay?
Okay, no problem.
Okay?
Okay, my email is ID there. You can
Yeah.
contact me.
Okay, thanks a lot,
Thank you.
and good luck.
Okay.
Keep us
Yes, I will.
updated
I
on
will.
your
I will.
passport documents. And
Okay, I will go to my embassy tomorrow morning and put the complaint. So prior to that, I will check my hotel room. If I got there by luck, by chance, then
Let's
it will be.
hope that you have
Yes,
your
yes.
passport there, okay?
Yes.
Let's hope you
So I
you
have
it there.
no.
Tell us what happened,
Okay, okay,
Anyway.
no problem.
okay?
Okay, I will inform you because the conference will continue for 3 days.
Yeah,
So I will inform you again.
okay,
I will come to here.
okay, very
Okay.
good, very good. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, I would like to thank the panelists and all of you, because I know it's a big effort to have come here at this time of the day, the siesta time for the Spanish people, and I think it's been such an effort that our poor colleague lost his passport and suitcase. Well, now we will proceed to have our Portuguese team address their crucial paper. I haven't said anything about the university or center of research where you work. I'll ask you to do it before you start
Okay.
the presentation of the
Okay,
paper.
fine.
I think it's good that not only you say where you work, well, how can you be located in case someone wants to keep
Sim,
in touch
sim,
with
sim,
you.
sim. Católica expressiva. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bañón Martínez. Good afternoon, everybody. So just a brief introduction. Eduardo Pereira Correia and myself, we are doing our PhD at Catholic University in Lisbon, and we also teach at High Institute of Police Sciences in Lisbon as well. And I just want to say two things before go into the paper, is that as it is a co-authored paper, we thought it would be better to one person make the presentation, and then for the questions, maybe the other person do the answers or the comments. And also, you may find in the program a different title, similar, but even though different, but not in the book. The book is correct, which is this one, because as long as we were, the first time we submitted the abstract, we had an idea, but as we were doing the paper, we realized that it would be better to change a little bit the title. So that's the difference to the program, but in the book is okay. So, presidential power, the dilemma of the Portuguese democratic system. The evolution of the Portuguese political system since 1976 has resulted in far-reaching changes to presidential powers over time. It is important to carry out a political analysis of the interaction of the four presidents within the political system. We will check the typical constraints on presidential power, especially the problem of constant change in the political competencies of the president, and based on the principle of safeguarding the values underpinning the political system, the president's exercise of power must be understood as a factor essential to the maturation of the Portuguese democracy, which is even though recent. So, the first one. The current democratic system has its origins in the overthrow of Estado Novo in the revolution of April 25 of 1974. The ideological divide between decolonization, which kept the country on three fronts of colonial war, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, an authoritarian regime, and military discontent led Portugal to a transition by rupture, with no negotiation between the elite and the opposition. Although the program laid down by the Movimento das Forças Armadas, the armed force movement, pointed to a parliamentary democracy, it explicitly comprised direct election of a president of the Republic, a characteristic of the semi-presidential system. The inauguration of this system of government in Portugal was the result of a conjunction of several factors. To a large extent, there was an existing military influence that permitted integration of the revolutionary military into the new political partisan system, coupled with the electorate's desire for participation after 5 decades of authoritarian rule. The memory of the troubled times of the First Republic in the beginning of the 20th century, and the need for a president elected by popular vote with significant constitutional powers to compensate for the instability from the pulverization of parliamentary parties would be the main influences of the post-revolutionary system. It is a semi-presidential system undergoing several mutations through all this democratic process to correct some imbalances in the institutions. On the President of the Republic, it is an essential balancing element of the Portuguese semi-presidential system. As head of state, the president represents the Portuguese Republic and is the guarantor of national independence, the unity of the state and the proper functioning of its democratic institutions. The president, thus, also has sole magistracy, ensuring and defending a broad consensus on major national objectives. This at times leads to somewhat ambiguous and comprehensive utterances that seek to defend the country's general interests. The nature of the legitimacy of the head of state, the set of powers assigned to it by the Constitution, and the fact that it is a sole sovereign body endow it with strong political influence, making the figure at the political constitutional center of gravity. The President of the Republic is commonly referred to as the primary vertex of a triangle formed also by the government and the Parliament, highlighting here his role in regulating the normal functioning of democratic institutions. As we shall examine later, over the period there have also been different interpretations of the role according to each president. However, today, its importance is unquestionable in promoting institutional cooperation and solidarity, although the role has no mandate to govern or to administer. The supra-partisan position allows the president to exercise the roles, since the position is taken to be an even-handed defender of the national interests. Added to this is an ability to communicate and make a direct contact with the country, exerting a real magistracy of influence. The eligibility for president is restricted to voters of Portuguese origin older than 35 years old. This means that candidates for president are older than for parliament, for which one has only to be 18 years old. The age requirement is due largely to the maturity necessary to fill the post, and in theory will lead the presidency to be a more conservative sovereign body and curb the excesses of the executive or the parliament. Furthermore, it runs the longest term of the three bodies of sovereignty. It runs for 5 years, promoting greater regime stability than the 4-year term of parliament. Finally, neither is the President of the Republic able to be re-elected to a third consecutive term, nor during the 5 years immediately following the end of the second consecutive term. If we analyze this behavior in democratic Portugal, we note that all 4 presidents have run for a second term, making a period of a decade in post for the first 3 holders, and invariably stronger election results than at the first election. By comparison, it is worth mentioning Italy, where the president is elected for a term of 7 years without term limits to renewal, and in practice there has been only 1 renewal for more than a single term, with Giorgio Napolitano. Ramalho Yanes was the first president elected by direct and universal suffrage in 1976, and the youngest president in the democratic period. The governments were politically accountable to the president and parliament, and the evolution of the party system would be shaped by the way the head of state came to exercise his constitutional powers. The shortcoming of the as yet immature political system forced Yanes to intervene frequently in order to rebalance the system. Yanes' performance of presidential domestic policy was marked by arbitration participant power. When taking the role of moderator, he did not refrain from publicly criticizing the policies of many executives, since he promoted government attempts at correcting and outlining the new political model. Swiftly, the president abandoned this role of president moderator and became a political actor. To all intents and purposes, he took a decisive step towards presidentiate of the political system, whereas many party leaders sought support in the stabilization of minority governments. Yanes was critical of executives and during this period engaged as a player and a referee. Interestingly, the first time that the president did not interfere directly in the composition of political parties and agreements, there was for the first time in history of the system an absolute majority. This came about naturally carried out by the center-right parties led by Yanes' main critic, Prime Minister Sá Carneiro. A constitution giving the president broad legal constitutional powers as well as a more intervention in political life contributed to this increase of powers and resulted in an unstable democratic transition. Yanes was in constant conflict with political parties, either with fierce criticism or threatening presidential intervention. In this sense, some considered that it was necessary to remove the president from the center of political life. In the balance of power of the political regime, Yanes has been able to make the political system more presidential and resulted largely from the weakness of government and parties represented in parliament. The first constitutional revision led to a reduction of powers of the president and the strengthening of parliamentary and government powers in order to correct the functioning of the political system. Here we made this table to show all the presidents on the left, all the presidential terms, and then the kind of constitutional powers they have, and the number of times they have exerted their powers. We With the election of Mário Soares, a civilian became president for the first time. So he was a former prime minister and past political prisoner, directly elected after more than 6 decades of military presidents. A year later, Soares had his first political crisis with the fall of Cavaco's government, following a motion of censure on the government. This was presented by the Partido Renovador Democrático with the concurrence of the Partido Socialista. But Soares came to take a different role to Yanes, even though pressed by his party. He remained independent by calling early elections, which gave the Partido Social Democrata the first absolute majority in parliament. In Soares' opinion, the role of the president is not, nor ever should be, countervailing, either in dispute with government or parliament. The understanding between the head of state and prime minister was guided by the concept of political cohabitation. Given the smooth coexistence with government, derived largely from the majority that supported it, Mário Soares unleashed the initiative of making tours called Presidências Abertas across the country. He organized a total of 11 national tours focused on specific subjects and promoting direct contact with the people. The result was huge media attention around the figure of the President of the Republic. It hurt to regard it as inaccessible and made dialogue possible. This approach to civil society shifted presidential power to the interior of the country. The Presidências Abertas made it possible to hear the nation and its concerns. In his first term, Soares politically vetoed 2 government measures, while in the second term there were 23 political vetoes. For Parliament, the difference was not so great, rising from 5 political vetoes in the first time to 7 in the second. So here is the figures for the percentage of the votes that they were elected. Or the percentage. Mário Soares had chosen a different way from his predecessor, Yanes, to exercise his mandate in accordance with his concept of the role of a president, a magistracy of influence based on a principle of no direct intervention in political party life. The arrival of Jorge Sampaio to the presidency in 1996 brought for the first time since April 25, 1974, a political scenario marked by a president and a relative majority in government of the same political family. This led to a relatively consensual first term, especially since the 3 main sovereign bodies were of the same political leaning, the socialists, and with whom, like his predecessor, Sampaio developed what he dubbed in his own inaugural speech, a magistracy of initiative. Sampaio's second term indicated a return to a presidential interventionism at the national level, as did Mário Soares, who exponentially increased the use of formal power in his second term. Sampaio promoted a greater interference in the political system. Jorge Sampaio ended his presidential term in 2006, having distinguished the presidential exercise with 2 important issues at international level, Macau and Timor. First, Sampaio saw a set of presidential powers evaporate, including powers relating to the special planning and administration of Macau. With the transition of Macau through the handover to the People's Republic of China, Portugal ended the overseas cycle started 5 centuries earlier. Second, in 1996, Sampaio demonstrated strong commitment to resolving the conflict in East Timor, a former Portuguese colony. After 2 decades of annexing the territory to Indonesia, Sampaio performed a decisive role in the international sphere, giving new impetus to the negotiations between Indonesia and the United Nations. So the last president, Cavaco Silva. At the start of his campaign in 2005, on the sidelines of a conference, Cavaco Silva claimed that the President of the Republic cannot be just a moderator, a listener, an arbiter, someone who promotes dialogue. It requires more to the President. And this was the result of his experience as a Prime Minister, dealing with Mário Soares as the President. These issues raised questions about Silva's interpretation of presidential powers, particularly if his candidacy would agitate for increased presidential powers, namely the negative powers and political direction. This forced the candidate to justify his position by stating, "I accept and respect the balance of powers in the Constitution that I consider adequate to our democratic system." During this research on presidential power, we noticed that the system of government in Portugal is based on a semi-presidential system where the political powers of the president rely mostly on negative supervision and control. Upon closer examination, it can be seen that those fields assigned to the head of state do not include political leadership, as this is reserved for government. The institutional balance of the system arises from the government's need for the president's consent to his policies, but also the support of the majority in parliament, forcing a political convergence without which it is not allowed to govern. Despite criticism that the semi-presidential system in Portugal is based on constitutional presidential powers that were substantially reduced in the 1982 amendment, thereby turning the head of state into a merely symbolic figure, we have seen the importance of presidential powers in the legal and constitutional fields. To the president is reserved the important supervision of the system, the unity of the state, and the guarantee of national sovereignty. Although in early instances the institutional figure of the president was marked by strong intervention, particularly in the creation of governments, by presidential initiatives during the troubled period of the democratic transition and an expressive use of exceptional powers, the Constitution has allowed the President to dismiss the government with virtually no limitation, simply required the preliminary hearing of the Council of the Revolution and those political parties represented in Parliament. For example, Yanes was confronted with government instability by the first executives, Soares faced the dissolution of the parliament, Sampaio dealt with the political crisis of the parliamentary majority, and more recently, the study of Cavaco Silva's first term shows the promotion of an institutional cooperation besides the highest number of political vetoes to the parliament. Presidential power in the Portuguese democratic system has caused all these dilemmas, which were conditioned by a magistracy of influence that allows the head of state to remain interventional in all emergencies in the life of the Republic. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's, oh, you have your, oh,
Yes.
oh, yes. Yes, yeah, you can.
It's a transferable
Let's see
device.
how far it goes. Wait a minute, wait a minute.
You can
Let the
just
girl
position it
do
somewhere
it.
here. It'll work.
Nos ayuda con esto. Wait a minute. Sí, desenchufa. De ahí, that's right. And we can plug it here. Y la otra es que no llega, ¿no? Can you let her sit down
Okay,
here?
yeah, okay. We have to change again.
Sí, can you sit here? Ms. Natalia Puskinova from Moscow State Institute of International Relations University of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Technology potentiates our power and limitates our responses. Ms. Puskinova is going to speak about the state building in conditions of state failure, sovereignty, legitimacy, and the recognition revisited, the case of Somalia. We've been lucky enough to get to the PowerPoint.
Hello everyone. Buenos días, señores y señoras. Gracias por su invitación para participar en este congreso. Y me llamo Natalia Piskunova, soy recerca y especialista en política africana en Somalia. Somalia, Etiopía, Eritrea, esa región. Y también soy profesora en Instituto de Relaciones Internacionales de Moscú, de Rusia. And so now we will continue in English so that you can see my presentation in Somali, and for those who speak only English could be able to pass some questions, discussion, and so on. Okay, I will try to keep it brief given the time frame and so on. My topic is quite vast. It deals on the issue of security and state building in negative conditions of ongoing civil war. In recent years, the idea of a revolution, the idea of a protest, and the idea of civil war has regained its attention given the situation in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, and worldwide also. My topic focuses more on the regional story. However, in this regional, even local story of Somalia, the failed state of Somalia, the failed territory, the failed government, we may extract certain ideas to pose new questions, to challenge our minds in assessing the broader issues of state building, the issue of positive and negative security, the issue of legitimacy and sovereignty. As a brief introduction, I can say that for almost more than 20 years, the problem of state failure has not been resolved. There has never been a result as efficient as it can be in building democratic or non-democratic, viable, effective institutions in place in Somalia. Another point is that may be interesting to you as well, that we all in conferences and congresses, we often speak of failure of the state or failures of the state and so on. However, we should always bear in mind that this is only a wording, but that is not an official definition accepted by the United Nations. If you'll have a look at the resolutions of the United Nations concerning Somalia, intervention, Somalia, humanitarian aid, all issues. If you take a look at the reports of the Secretary General concerning Somalia and their issues, you will never find the exact wording of the state failure. You will find other wordings: problems, problem solution, conflict areas, devastation, anything will appear, but if you browse through the text, not such a definition will not be allowed, which is an interesting point to review. Another thing is that the failure of the state in Somalia poses more questions. Is it good or bad? Instinctively, we can say any conflict is bad, any war is bad. But if we come to theorize, then we can see that if you take one of the actors from the territory, from the system of political and economic interactions which existed in that territory for many years, then you will find a white place, a wild spot, which can then be filled by any other player, which is an interesting thing in concept of game theory, for example, and system analysis as well. So then the question is, can we view state failure within the global concept of state formation and building of the state? The logic is very easy. In order to build something new, maybe it is necessary first to deconstruct something old, to make something new appear, which is a very sensitive issue, of course. It may provoke debate, and that's what I'm aiming at, a bit provocative thing. Another question, which is more local to my report here, is that can we regard what de facto exists in Somalia, including Somaliland, Puntland, Mahir, Galmudug region, and other regions, as self-emerging authorities, actors of the international system, political, territorial entities, or we should never regard them as such actors? and still continue to view only state, only Somalia, in notwithstanding the fact that it is not working, it's not existent. It cannot even control the security in the capital, Mogadishu, as well. That's another question. And of course, definitely, it is hard to define the emerging entities, given that the 5 classic criterions for certifying a state as a state may be quite vague in conditions of Somalia as well. I will probably skip a few things in conclusion and so on. I would like to make yet another provocative remark, I hope, concerning the merge of international law perspective on territorial entities in state failure and international relations and international politics perspective. As we all know, that there, well, as I've already said, there is a paradox that it's not legally recognized anywhere in all documents, bilateral, multilateral, UN documents, no such thing as such a state failure ever appears. Another thing is that there's definitely a challenge, both for the diplomats and for theorists, as such as we are. And there is another thing that was put forward to discussion in 1997, but then somehow was probably vague, maybe probably somehow excluded from the attention of scholars, is that if we have a mechanism of authorizing a state, if we have, say, a system of mandates of a state, if we have a system of certification of state, by giving them a status of a state. For example, recent recognition of South Sudan, for example, right, which was given the right to be a state, all the status, the bonuses, and so on. Then, why is this mechanism going only one way? Can it be a two-way process? Can an international system allow, at a certain point of development, to decertify the state and say, this is not longer a state, we should not certify them as state? But this is another provocative question which lies when we try to analyze Somalia. In order to give any status to emerging entities, first you have to deal with the status of the former entity, which was an umbrella state for them. So which means taking away the status of a state from Somalia, and then only then starting discussion of whether we can and should regard Puntland and Somaliland and any other authorities as proto-state authorities or not. And that's another question. Yes, and I would like to say also that in international legal and political practice, there is a tradition and there is a way of recognizing seceding entities or entities which are currently at war with each other. This also applies to revolutions, and this can be applied, well, certain scholars now apply these principles to analyzing what happens in the Arab Spring regions now, so whether we have to recognize them or not recognize them and so on. So this is another thing. Political perspective, this is quite vast. I will not, of course, bother you with all of those lengthy letters and so on. Just a couple of things which I would like to put to you. There is an opportunity to debate and to discuss if the notion of a belligerent recognition is applicable to the newly created states or state formations, let's call them this way, because they are not yet states. Belligerent recognition is a term in international law which has been practiced a lot. I would just say that this is not trusteeship mandate, this is belligerent recognition when you officially recognize formations, entities as having political authority, diplomatic authority, without calling them states. So this is an interesting notion which may be quite good to explore and to discuss as well. So in my opinion, this can be applicable to Somalia, to Puntland and Somaliland, because they have never applied to the UN with a request to have the status of a state, full scale, but they, in fact, have the authority, they have the borders, the constant population, and they have the homogeneous nations which form their populace as well. So this can be a point for debate and which can be put forward to the table as well. Speaking about the actors, if we try to recognize a state, if we try to deal with this point, then inevitably we will have to deal with points of legitimacy and sovereignty. So where does sovereignty lie in Somalia? Who possesses this sovereignty? Who has the right to deal with it? Who has the power? And why and how these actors have legitimate rights of having this authority. In classical European terms, since ancient Greece and ancient Rome, there should be election and there should be a power which is elected and rotated in the principle of political rotation, and then it is deemed as legitimate. However, in conditions of Middle East and Africa, this system does not work. In Africa, as you probably are familiar with these stories, in each country of Africa, or sometimes even in regions because of the ethnical composition, the rules of legitimacy and sovereignty can be absolutely different and have absolutely no relation to whichever elections they may be. However, in certain tribes, they do elect the tribe leader sometimes, so it also happens. So these are interesting points here. If we speak about Somalia, sovereignty, the sovereignty holder is the so-called patronate-based elite. What is that, right? So patronate-based elite is actually representing an ethnic clan, a family, usually, in which you can only be born just by birth. You are born into this family and automatically you become a member of this patronate-based elite. Why the word patronate-based somehow exists here? The thing is that there are patron-client relations between different elites. There are 4 basic clans in Somalia, and also within clans, they also have patron, and then they have clients according to their family, descent, relationship, and so on. So these are sovereignty holders in Somalia. And thus, these sovereignty holders accept the right to rule, not to be ruled, which is interesting, to rule but not to be ruled again. And that is how they obtain legitimacy. It is legitimacy by birth and by always staying in one ethnic clan or tribe, because in Africa the tribal issue is still important as well. So in this case we can say that legitimacy in terms of newly created entities in Somalia is traditional, based on traditional descent in Africa, but not electoral. It has nothing to do with elections. And by finalizing a few words, I just wanted to say that there is a collision of international principles when we deal with state failure. One is principle of territorial integrity, and another is a principle of self-determination. But this is mostly the debate for legal discussion. But if you are interested, we can continue on this. And I've already spoken about belligerent recognition as well. Certain points for consideration here, that we may also speak of such notions as unilateral secession, or we can speak of dissolution of the state, which is more the case of the state failure, but this is also for presentation. This is included in the text and in the book and so on. That's what I said already. And just to conclude, I would like to say that a lot of points have been mentioned here. Belligerent recognition, recognizing as with a status belli, recognizing not as state but a proto-state or entity, patronate-based elite versus classical or traditional notion of elite, sovereignty, which is based not on classical rules but on the power of the 4 clans, and so who is the ruling of the clan, has the ruling of the clan, has the ruling of his or her territory as well. That is how sovereignty goes. And legitimacy, which has rotation principle only within the clan. So these are certain pillars that constitute the situation in Somalia, if we try to speak about this more. But what we have in present in Somalia, it is the spiral of violence, which starts from the clan, and then it goes on considering maritime piracy issue, which is a top issue always in news, considering the issue of non-democratic regimes, transition, and so on. So these are the points that I wanted to deliver, mostly to pose questions than to receive answers. So I will be glad if you have more questions and more say ideas on Somalia after this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we better go ahead with your paper, and then we'll open the yeah. Go ahead. Now, Ms. Vida Masikenaite is going to speak about coping with scarcity, Chinese state business relations in fisheries industry.
I'm sorry, just it takes some time.
Yeah, don't worry about it. She's a PhD candidate in Graduate School of Media and Governance in Keio University. It's very interesting. The Japanese, being the first consumer of fish in the world, the second is Spain, are now starting to get worried about their good neighbors, historically, the Chinese, who are the first fishery industry in the world, the Chinese. So I guess the Japanese are losing some competitive advantage and are losing a big deal in their first needs consumption. And I think that's interesting because Chinese are doing this in a very peculiar way, with a very peculiar design. That's what Ms. Masikenaite is going to explain. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon once again. Yes, I've already been introduced. My name is Vida Masikenaite, and yeah, but your pronunciation was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just sorry it's so difficult. And so I'm a PhD candidate now at Keio University in Japan, where I'm majoring in China studies, well, in Chinese politics actually. And I'm also teaching part-time at the International University of Japan, and I have two courses. One of them is Chinese domestic politics, and the other one is Chinese foreign policy. So Chinese foreign policy and Chinese domestic politics, yes. So I'm mainly, not mainly, I'm working on China. And today, well, I would like to talk about state business relations in China. And I have taken this fisheries industry as a case study to see how the state is actually addressing the issue of scarcity through state business relations. May I have my water? I'm sorry. Thanks. Sorry. And okay, this is not working. Yes, I'm sorry. Like I said already, my main question was how has the state's ability in China to address these issues of scarcity as the business-state relationship has evolved since the beginning of the economic reform. And of course here you may ask why I'm looking why out of all the possible industries I'm actually looking at the fisheries industry. And well, the answer is simple and not simple at the same time, because every time when I start talking about fisheries, I receive this critique that, well, fisheries industry and oil industry or steel industry is just so different. Like you cannot, some people would say that I cannot put fisheries industry and steel on the same shelf. But the point is that the way I see fisheries is, well, fish stocks as one of the resources. And in my paper also, I looked historically at this issue in China. And what I found that this was probably one of the first resources in the early beginning of China's economic reform, when the state felt how scarce it was. What I mean by that is that this discussion about fish stocks started around 1978, 79, just the early beginning of economic reform. And I guess you already know from history that at that time in China, China was basically devastated. That was the first years after the Cultural Revolution. And rather than steel, fish was something, like food supply was a very important issue. And at the same time, another problem that the state in China, the government in China was facing was environmental degradation of its coastal waters. So I thought that this would be a rather convenient case to see how the state in early beginning of economic reform, how it tried to use business, or this relationship between the state and the business, to address the issue of scarcity. And I believe that in a way this analysis could serve as a model, or could give some insights for further studies of how Chinese state addresses scarcity. Then we can talk about steel and other industries. And one more point that I have to mention why fisheries industry offers a good case study is that it has a much longer history. This industry development in China has a much longer history. And in early 1980s, it was decided for the first time, officially, the state had decided that they would start developing distant water fisheries. So in a way, this also provides comparatively a lot material to examine, to look at. And then I already explained in a way how I organized my argument. So first, like I said, I looked at fisheries as a scarce resource, and I looked at the policies that Chinese government took in the discussion that took place in China in late 70s when they were discussing this scarcity. Then the policies they took, which started in early 80s and later on. And later I looked at how the state how it established the enterprises and how it tried to use this state-business relations to solve the scarcity problem, and what kind of relationship between state and business emerged before the reform and after. I'm sure most of you have heard of the state-owned, as I call it, state-owned enterprise, SOE, reform in China, which was a very big thing during the economic reform. And then I also, so I basically traced back the evolution of the state-business relationship. And then I looked what kind of new relationship emerged that was already after 2000, and then just discussion, final conclusions and discussions that I would like to look at quickly. And so I've explained already about why fisheries and how it becomes a scarce resource in China. And so here, two important things talking about this, the relationship which emerged after 1980s. In 1980s, two aspects that deserve consideration. So one is institutional development, how the new enterprises were established and reorganized to address scarcity, and another one, China's foreign policy. Often when I start talking about fisheries industry and Chinese state, I receive a question, is it worth talking about the state? Isn't it only business and only enterprises would be involved in it? As a matter of fact, in the early beginning, by early beginning I mean when the government became aware of the issue of fish stocks scarcity and environmental degradation in coastal waters, the government took a pretty active position in foreign policy. And first, the ambassadors were instructed to promote cooperation of Chinese companies with other states. And then there were a number of bilateral agreements signed between Chinese government and other governments in Africa at first, also Italy, and even the United States. And to give you an idea what was happening at the level of institutional development, so first, the government, when they faced the problem, first they established, or I should say probably they reorganized the existing companies, well, the existing state-owned enterprises, and they established this China Fisheries Joint Corporation, which basically was the main, and in the early beginning actually the only agent promoting China's distant water fisheries overseas. But that was like this company, I would say, was acting as an agent of the state at that time in the 80s. Then they restructured local enterprises, but this was all done still under very, very strict supervision of the state. And well, those of you who are familiar with Chinese policy making would understand what I mean by, well, why I mentioned this, the leading small group establishment in China. The leading small groups, well, just to give you a brief explanation, what a leading small group in China is. Usually when there is a very sensitive issue or a very important issue, these issues in China are negotiated not in the government, not in the parliament, not in the formal institutions, but in the so-called leading small groups. And even now in China, there is a leading small group on Taiwan. There's a leading small group on issues on relations with Japan. But there's like the number of these groups is rather limited, and they usually address very important issues. And for me, this was also very interesting that they would actually establish leading small group for fisheries corporation. And here I want to point out that business representatives, well, at that time, still it was very close to the state, but the representatives of the state-owned enterprises were also present in these this leading small group. And I have to mention that leading small group, especially even now in leading small group on foreign affairs, is actually the main decision-making body. It is not a formal decision-making body in China, but usually the decisions are made in the small group, like very, very small group of people attend, also business representatives, and then these decisions in China are passed over for implementation. So that's why I would say that at that time that was a very important point. And well, this was basically the structure, well, the pattern which emerged before the state-owned enterprise reform. And well, I have to acknowledge myself that this is not surprising, because in 80s, even in early 90s, these were the early stages of China's economic reform. So state was pretty close with the business, and this is what I expected to find in a way. But then my major interest was what happened during the state-owned enterprise reform. And what I expected was that these fisheries enterprises would become they would go private, and they would simply become just any other industry in China. Well, not in China, just like any other industry, right? Because the main purpose of this reform was to part the government and enterprises. So they wanted, the government itself, well, at least they declared that they wanted business to go business-like and state to be on its own. But result, well, like I said, it was different from what I expected. The result was actually different. And I want to give you a brief introduction of what happened during this reform, what happened with the state-owned enterprises. And here's just very, very simple explanation. So State Council in China is, as we understand, a government. I mean, in understanding of in Western terms, or in Western countries, that would be a government, like the cabinet, so State Council in China. And during the state-owned enterprise reform, they established under the government, Chinese government, State Council, there was established a commission called State-Owned Asset Supervision and Reform Commission. And it's important, like the most important thing to say here is that this was the commission that took responsibility and took the charge of all the state-owned enterprises that remained in China. So now basically the main enterprises are under this commission, and all the other ones, small ones, they just went private. And looking at this, I expected that fisheries would also go private, and that the government wouldn't really, well, it's not that it wouldn't be bothered, but that the government wouldn't pay so much attention to it. Because this commission maintained supervision of over 100 state-owned enterprises. And one of these 100, well, to be precise, 117 state-owned enterprises was the so-called China National Agricultural Development Group Corporation. So just another step in this hierarchy in the system. And this state-owned enterprise maintained power. Well, it's in a way it acts as a subsidiary over China's National Fisheries Corporation. This is the same company that that was established in mid-90s, in mid-80s, when the government just started becoming aware of the fisheries-related problems in China. So what we see here, once again, I want to emphasize that this commission, which is now in charge of China's state-owned enterprises, under its supervision, it has all the so-called key industries, which would be like communications, raw materials, oil, well, another raw material, right? Aviation, so these strategically important industries for the country. And also agriculture is one of them, which I found to be quite interesting. And so fisheries, just going down the ladder, fisheries would be also under the supervision of this commission. And at the very at the very bottom would be the subsidiaries. And I just mentioned them in my paper. I don't actually go deeper in my paper talking about subsidiaries. But here I want to note that a very interesting thing is that when we look at China's fisheries industry, overseas there seem to be a lot of enterprises operating, and it seems that they're all private. So it's just like another corporation. But when I started looking at all the system, like whose subsidiaries they actually are, I found that a very significant number, basically the majority of these companies, fishing companies operating overseas, they are actually related to this main company, China National Fisheries Corporation, which then leads them up and finally to the government. And so this is how institutionally the industry looks now. And well, as I said, the main purpose of this reform, of establishment of this commission, was to somehow separate, to make it more business-like, the government from business. But then I wanted to check to what extent the government the state was separated from business, the other way around, the business was separated from the state. And I looked at this personal level. And here in China, we have a very, very interesting, picture. And from what I found out later, it seems that this is the regular pattern in most of the industries, that people, the ones who take charge, or the ones who become the chairman, the managers of these state-owned enterprises and their subsidiaries, these are usually the people from like earlier bureaucrats from the same industries. So what I'm saying is that in particularly this case in the fisheries, the chairman of the main enterprise, the main fisheries enterprise, and some of the subsidiaries, these are people who used to work in the Ministry of Agriculture. So in this way, like they really have a very close link with the government, like with the system. And another point that they do, although they claim to be only like enterprises, although they are state-owned enterprises, but they would like to be seen just as any other enterprises, they do take part in policy making. Like I've observed, I've checked several meetings, several cases of decision making, and then I found that these, the chairman or managers of the enterprises would also be present. And another thing, the final one would be that also there is obviously a close link between them with the main state officials, with the key officials. And I looked at the visits, officials visiting the base of China National Fisheries Corporation. They have a base in Las Palmas. And since 2000, we see that there's a regularly like a president, prime minister, premier, or the head of National People's Congress, Chinese Parliament. They would be visiting it once in a while, which is also very interesting. So, and why I'm talking about this, like the main point I'm trying to make is that the main question is, if the relationship is really so close, So like I said, my main purpose was to see like, has this relationship become more like, well, has the business become more independent or not? That was my main question. And what I found that it seems that business is acting more independently from the state. So for example, they don't need the state anymore to go to some countries and establish bilateral cooperation in fisheries. The business now is doing it by itself. But if this is the case, my main question is, and well, this is a question for further research as well. My main question is like, what is the direction of influence? Because if these relationships between the state and business is as well, I'm not saying that is as close as it used to be, but it's still very close. So is it the state using business to address resource scarcity, or is it the other way around? I'm saying that if the business acts pretty independently, for example, when China terminated its relationships with Guinea because of one China policy, corporations went there and they established this like the same agreement basically on its own. And so the question is, to what extent business starts influencing the state? And in this paper, I talked only about the fisheries, but like I said, I saw this as a convenient case study to see how this relationship unfolds. And in the future, I'm also thinking about, well, on the other hand, this is difficult to see, like the actual business-state relationship is very difficult to see in China. But it would be interesting also to think how it works in other cases, let's say Iran, Sudan, these countries when China receives international pressure not to cooperate, not to have too close relationship, and to what extent the business interests actually play a role then. That was my main question. So that would be it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, now we're going to have the period of general discussion of the three papers. If you notice, they address different topics. The three of them are local, but none of them is local because they address concepts. Then existing failure of the state, the strategy of market penetration and competitive advantage of China through public corporations, the presidential problems, and a good part of a transition from authoritarian to democratic system in Portugal, accounting with the dismissal or the evolution, unequal evolution of the presidency, which is a heritage of a previous non-democratic government, which is transformed through the time. And, well, you have your chance to now interrelate with paper givers, with the panelists. If any of you have difficulties with the English language, I'll be delighted to translate or help you out with the question. You could even speak Portuguese to them. Go ahead. You have to speak with a microphone. Because we're being taped. If you don't do it with a microphone, it won't be taped.
Hi, my name is Andres Martinez. I'm from Alicante University. I'm a PhD candidate. Thank you for the papers and for the presentation. My question is from the second paper from the professor that talks about Somalia. I want to know, maybe in your search, that you can find any relationship between the failure state and the environment problem in Somalia and with the fishery industry, because if you know, in all the coast there is armed forces that are very dangerous for the fishery industry, especially for the Spanish industry. There is a several case of kidnapping. Maybe what's the strategy at the future of the European Union, or maybe the UN, the Security Council of the United Nations at the future? Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for the question. The thing is that I have a special report on maritime piracy of the coastline of Somalia, so that's a good opportunity to speak about this in context of speaking about state failure and state building in Somalia. So what we have now is that you are right by saying that there is a big problem with kidnapping, with shipwrecking, and there is a big problem not only with the fisheries but also with oil transfer. This is very important. The thing is that the Gulf of Aden, territorially, it is the Gulf which both connects and divides the Indian Ocean and the passages to Europe, as well as the passages to Latin America and North America. And according to the statistical agencies worldwide, every year the Aden Gulf sees about 30,000 ships which pass through it with a cargo, oil cargo, fish cargo, machinery, whichever. So if we consider these statistics, and if we then compare it with the statistic of shipwreck and kidnapping, the numbers will be devastating. About 1,000 ships which pass actually experience certain tracking by pirates. They try maneuvering, they experience shipwreck, or they experience attempts of kidnapping of the personnel, or attempts to take off their cargo for loot, attempts to bargain, and so on. Every year these numbers differ. One year it can be 114 ships registered, only registered attempts. In another year it can be almost 800. I can say that for year 2011-2012 period, the last period for which the facts are available, the area, the zone of attacks of Somalia pirates has been extended up to, it was not only until during the Somali line along the coastline, it actually extended until Indian coastline. It was 800 kilometers to the coast of India. So we can now speak about not only about Somalia piracy just in regional term, it is now a worldwide problem. Speaking about the problems of embargo and so on, and there is a relationship of this problem with maritime piracy. As you know, that there is a special European Union agency which is called EU NAV4, Navigation Force, which has the authority to monitor all ships which pass Aden Gulf. They have to register. This is voluntary, but it's very recommended that they register before they pass on their navigation route along the Somalia coastline, Kenya, Tanzania, and this area, so that EU NAV4 can actually provide them with special assistance. And there is another issue more related to business, that companies, oil companies, fish extracting companies, cargo companies have started which is called non-state or private versus military accompanying the ships, and this also deals with the huge insurance rates, because it is very hard to insure a cargo against piracy. It is very hard to document this. So there is also a new development line in international insurance industry and international also trading routes as well. I would say that this problem also envisages a certain requirements for embargo, but you cannot actually control on ground. And this is the problem. UN may issue an embargo to ban all imports to Somalia. However, this will it will act as a stick with both ends. If you stop importing to Somalia of any goods, say let's imagine this total situation that you stop importing goods, it means that you also have to ban importing humanitarian aid, which is also a big problem. Given the climate conditions with devastating climate conditions, with region experiencing droughts very often, this will lead to starvation of the people, which is not actually the aim of the international community. So I would rather advise against putting embargoes on Somalia, because this is a linkage that only strikes people. It doesn't strike pirates. They are impossible to find, in fact. So this would be more a debate towards debate as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to put forward a question? Or I would like to put myself a question, because you describe Vida, you describe how the fishery industry is working, but you didn't have a reflection that I could catch up of a strategic thought behind the development of the fishery public industries in China. And another thing, how about the design of the corporations? It called my attention that first there's two public corporations, and then the subsidiaries, which might have form of private industries, and it's not clear whether it's shareholding. I mean, do they go to the market? They have different shareholders, or it's 100% state-owned? And do they have a special status, or they just work like any private industry? Well,
Thank you. Sorry. So, just first, you mentioned strategic thought. I'm not sure if I may clarify what you mean by that. It's
yeah.
just
Is there any strategic thought behind the development of the fishery industries through the time? You dated in the 1970s, the beginning of the formation of the fishery industry, right?
Yes. So it would be, like I said, in the beginning, it was absolutely obvious that this was all about the resources. Like they needed, like
Scarcity.
yeah, it was because then the environmental degradation in the coastal waters was pretty severe. Well, not pretty. It was very severe. It was like mainly banned in at that time, like in early 80s. But so, and I thought that this would probably be further, like this thought to secure scarcity would be also carried out further. But what it seems to be now, well, there are different arguments, but one of them is, well, it seems to actually be only about profits, because if we look at the import back to China, they are not importing back that much. Because the problem is that what these corporations now are catching, this is still too expensive for China's domestic market, so most of the things would be exported. By the way, like this is a bit different topic, but this is actually the case with oil as well. They're not importing that much back to China. And then, like as you mentioned, strategic. I have to point out that there's, well, like rising debate about China's fisheries, fisheries-related activities, because it seems that China has been using this strategically to reinforce its claims in the South China Sea, because they are not allowed to fish in the coastal waters. There is also a summer moratorium, fishing ban. So the boats start going down, like further into the disputed territories. And when this is the case, it becomes in a way a tool to, well, we are protecting our fishermen, but actually it's like the idea, the back thought, there's another idea behind that as well. So I would say that now strategically this is not that much about the resource scarcity, I would say. It is more about the, well, China going to the blue waters. This is basically what it is, yes. And then, sorry, just another part of the question about the design of the corporations. It is very difficult to distinguish which one is which. And the problem with Chinese corporations, even when they act somewhere overseas, I would say that it always needs to be double checked what kind, like where they come from and who is the owner, because these state-owned, I cannot say about the subsidiaries. I didn't look that deep. I didn't go to these small ones, but even the state-owned enterprises, they are listed in stock markets and they act as just like private entities. And this is why there is this division among the observers. Like some would say they act absolutely as private corporations, and there's nothing, like, it doesn't mean anything that they are state-owned enterprises. But when, like I said, when we look at this personal level, at the participation in the decision-making, it becomes, that not that simple, obviously. So they do act as enterprises, but their state interest is still present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marcela, you want to?
Just continuing some information debate on this. I just wanted to speak about maybe two questions to talk about some recent developments. As you know, in the end of March, we have seen an interesting political event. It was the summit of the BRICS organization in Durban in South Africa. For those unfamiliar with this, this is international economic and political, not yet organization, but a forum rather, which includes Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa. And continuing talking about what happens now between all these countries and countries which come in there, as we say, farwater as well. It is interesting to see what may happen in the future. What can be the perspectives of internal economy when and if BRICS comes along and starts obtaining its power? So do you think, what small question to that probably, just your personal opinion, I mean, maybe perspective, what do you feel, so on. Do you think that, given that China has joined BRICS, was one of its founding fathers in fact, there will be any change or development, say, in this state-corporate relations in China, in any industry, or it is very strong and it will be unaffected and stable? Because this is an interesting question to dwell on, because I can say on South Africa what I have seen on researching relationship and ideas of South Africa joining BRICS is that actually, yes, this is an attempt to take internal problems and make them external, using the international manipulation of the organization. Is it the case of China? A question remains open. That is interesting for me, so maybe you could talk a little bit about this.
Thank you. Actually, I like talking about BRICS. I don't see China, like this being the case for China. Yeah. Because, like, well, China, when it comes to BRICS, I would say that also China has its own agenda in a way. Like, I mean, it's more like political agenda. I'm not saying that they are balancing against the U.S. or like that they are challenging the existing like international order. But this is mainly the point, I think. And it might be the case for other countries like South Africa or Brazil, but I think China, it's just too, like this bond, state business bond, it's just too strong that it would change something.
So it will remain as,
Try to
it is.
speak to the
Yeah.
microphone.
I'm sorry.
So that would be rather no relation, because the question, the reason for my asking so was the China's policy in Africa, the development of Chinese policy in Africa. That's why I was asking. They export both goods and labor to Kenya, to Tanzania. Recent projects in 2012, 2013, I have data until March 2013, mostly recent. They have a plan of establishing loans of $85 million in Kenya and Tanzania, and that's why there is another say a flip side of the coin. They're not giving it back. They're giving money, people, products, but they are not taking them to China. And that was interesting why this happens, and this is only with private companies. It's not the state which goes into Africa, it's the private companies. It was interesting, yeah.
Try to speak one at a time, one after another,
Yeah.
to the microphone. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. I guess we would need to hear a clarification, like who are the companies going?
Talk to the microphone. So that
I think everyone hears, no?
Go.
I'm not sure I can go any closer, but yeah.
Outside.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's only private companies going, because there's a very, very like strict control back at home in China, what companies can go overseas. Like when it comes to foreign direct investment, so Chinese companies investing overseas, there are very, very strict regulations in China who can do that. And it's actually, if it's a major investment, Chinese private corporations, they wouldn't be able to do that. And there have been cases when I've just heard this presentation by a researcher from, like Chinese researcher working in Boston now, Boston University. And how she explained that, like her point was that private corporations, basically they don't go overseas because they are not allowed to. And even when China started, like when the government started promoting this, it was mainly focused on the state-owned enterprises. And like I mentioned before, like you always have to check, like to trace back where is the root of this company, because at the end of the day, it's still probably a major state-owned enterprise. I mean, I don't want to argue claim this about all the corporations, but still, like there's a tendency. And then another point, talking about Africa, like you said that they are not taking anything back. Actually, there's I would say it's like an exchange, because usually all these loans, they don't give loans just for Africa. I mean, of course, they are doing a great job in Africa. I should admit that. But usually these loans, they are based on, they don't have to pay them back, but this is an exchange for the resources. And what companies take back, they usually take back the resources. And who takes the resources? It's state-owned enterprises, in one way or another. And, well, they do not necessarily take them back. They take it, but not necessarily take to China. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's what I wanted, an interesting question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to address any of the panelists? I don't know if you've been able to follow the discussion here on my right, accidental right. But while they were speaking about the Chinese strategy of worldwide expansion, I was thinking about two companies which are belong to this multinational company, which is the Vatican, the Jesuits and the Opus Dei. The Jesuits, they go out and with two men, they make an organization. Their style of leadership is a style very open, well, more like the American, even the Russian. The Opus Dei is more similar to the Chinese style of leadership. they give you a loan, they put their man, they export the Chinese, and then they take the profits back to China. So that's more the Opus Dei type of leadership. And that's why I don't understand I don't understand what you were saying about not taking back the profits from Africa. I don't see that. That has to be proof. I've been following the expansion of China in South America and part of Africa, and the pattern is always the same. That's why I asked you about the fisheries industry and their strategic thought, because I envision that from the 1970s on, China started going into the fishery not because of a scarcity or severe problem, ecological problem. They went into it for political and economic reasons, not only environmental stimulus. And the development or the industry, the development of the fisheries follows the pattern that they always follow. They have a kind of a public corporation, and then it's like the grapes. You know, you have the big grape thing, and then all these grains. They have the public corporation, which acts as a holding company, and then you have these, what you call the subsidiaries, fisheries companies, which are not easy to identify, in which they don't have a juridical form which is homogeneous. Well, they're not in the heritage of the French model that everything has to be equal. They're capable of doing very different things to reach the same goals. And I don't know, I kind of think that in the fisheries they have this pattern, which if identified, if they study properly, will give you a clue for another sectors of economic activity. And that doesn't have to do anything with international expansion. It has to do with the control even of the territory, and especially their ancient competitive position with Japan. Well, if you're already tired, we can close the panel, or else you want to intervene more. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Obrigado.